Imagine a world with no central heating, no electric lights, and no grocery stores stocked with winter food. For medieval peasants, surviving the brutal cold wasn't just a seasonal inconvenience, it was a matter of life and death. Yet somehow, year after year, they endured. How did they do it? In this video, we'll step back into the Middle Ages to explore the resourceful, rugged, and often ingenious ways that peasants braved the harshest season with nothing but their wits, their community, and the world around them. The battle for survival during a medieval winter didn't start in December. It began in the spring and intensified throughout the summer and fall. Every task a peasant undertook during the warmer months was done with the looming specter of winter in mind. If they failed to prepare adequately, the consequences could be fatal. There were no second chances, no safety nets. The medieval world was harsh, and nature was unforgiving. As soon as the first frost melted and the ground softened, peasants took to the fields. Plowing began with simple wooden tools, often pulled by oxen, to prepare the soil for planting. They sowed grains like barley, rye, and oats, staple crops that could be dried and stored for the long winter months. Timing was crucial. A delayed planting could mean a poor harvest. A poor harvest could mean starvation. But it wasn't just about food. Firewood was a top priority. Entire families, including children, gathered branches and felled trees during the warmer months. Wood had to be chopped, split, and left to dry in the sun. Wet wood was practically useless. It smoked, gave little heat, and could even poison the air inside a home. So, weeks were spent ensuring there would be enough dry firewood stacked neatly outside cottages, ready to burn when the icy winds arrived. Peasants also focused on preservation. Once fruits ripened and vegetables were pulled from the soil, the process of storing them began. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and carrots were packed into underground cellars layered with straw to keep them from freezing. Herbs were hung in bundles from ceiling beams to dry. Berries were sometimes boiled into jams or vinegars. Nothing was wasted. Every edible part of a plant or animal was used, even bones, which were saved for broths. Livestock, too, had to be managed with winter in mind. Not all animals could be kept through the cold months. There simply wouldn't be enough feed. So, during the fall, many animals were slaughtered. The meat was salted, smoked, or dried, stored in barrels, or hung from hooks in cool places. Fat was rendered into lard for cooking. Hides were scraped and stretched, used for clothing or traded for goods. Even the intestines found purpose, often used for sausage casings or simple tools. Clothing production was another part of winter preparation. Wool sheared in spring was spun into thread and woven into fabric. Peasant women, often after long days in the fields, spent evenings spinning wool by the fire. Simple garments were patched, layered, or lined with fur if available. Boots and cloaks were repaired or handed down. With no central heating, clothing served as the first line of defense against the cold. Housing was reinforced too. Roofs were checked and rethatched if necessary. Walls were patched with mud and straw to reduce drafts. Windows, if homes had them at all, were covered with oiled cloth or animal bladders to keep out the cold wind. Even the layout of the home reflected survival needs. Most cottages had a single room where the fire could warm everyone and everything in one place. In essence, every waking moment outside of winter was part of a long, unending race against time. There were no vacations, no lazy afternoons. The very rhythm of life revolved around the seasons, and winter was the harsh judge at the end of the cycle. To be a medieval peasant was to live in a state of constant preparation, driven not by luxury, but by necessity. Staying warm during the unforgiving winters of the medieval period was a challenge that tested the limits of human resilience and ingenuity. Peasants lived in small, crudely built homes that offered little insulation by modern standards. Yet, despite the cold winds that howled through the forests and across the open fields, they found ways to endure. The typical peasant home was constructed using local, readily available materials. Wattle and daub, Interwoven wooden sticks coated with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung formed the walls. The roof was usually thatched with layers of dried straw or reeds. These materials offered some protection against the elements, but they weren't particularly effective at keeping out the biting cold. Gaps in the walls and roof often let in drafts, and during storms, snow and rain could seep through. The hearth was the heart of the medieval home. Located in the center of the single-room dwelling, it served as the primary source of both heat and light. A fire burned constantly during the winter months, fueled by the firewood painstakingly collected and dried in the months before. The hearth wasn't just for cooking, it was essential for survival. Its warmth radiated outward, offering some relief from the cold, though the further one moved from it, the colder it got. In smaller homes, the smoke from the fire often filled the room, especially in houses without chimneys. Many peasants lived with a perpetual haze inside their homes, their eyes stinging and their lungs coughing. But it was a small price to pay for warmth. To preserve heat, peasants used every available method. Windows were small, often little more than slits, and rarely made of glass. They might be covered with cloth soaked in oil to let in light while blocking wind, or even with thin pieces of animal hide. During the coldest months, these windows were sometimes sealed entirely to keep the heat inside. Doors were kept shut as much as possible and were often reinforced with heavy cloths or animal skins to reduce drafts. Some homes had internal partitions made of wood or fabric to trap warmth in sleeping areas. Peasants layered their clothing heavily during winter. Wool was the material of choice, valued for its ability to retain heat even when damp. Multiple layers were worn. Tunics, cloaks, leggings, and caps were all made from coarse, homespun wool. Cloaks were fastened tightly and often lined with fur or sheepskin if it could be afforded. Footwear was stuffed with straw or wool to provide insulation. Mittens and hoods helped protect extremities from frostbite. Clothing wasn't changed often. It was precious and functional, and wearing the same garments day after day was common practice. Nighttime presented its own set of challenges. Without fires burning through the night, since fuel had to be conserved, peasants relied on shared body heat. Families, and sometimes even animals, slept together in the same room, if not in the same bed. It was not uncommon for a family to bring in a goat or pig to share the warmth. Beds were often little more than wooden frames filled with straw, covered by rough woolen blankets or animal skins. Sleepwear wasn't a separate category. People slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, wrapped tightly in anything warm they could find. Some homes, especially those of slightly better-off peasants, featured a feature known as a hooded fireplace, or inglenook, a recessed area where people could sit closer to the fire and shield themselves from drafts. In certain regions, peat or dried animal dung supplemented firewood when supplies ran low. Though it gave off an unpleasant odor, it burned slowly and could provide heat for hours. Community life also played a role in staying warm. People gathered together in shared spaces when possible, such as at the village church or communal barns, both of which retained heat more effectively due to their larger size and thicker walls. In times of extreme cold, neighbors might stay together under one roof, combining resources and body heat to ride out especially brutal nights. In the end, surviving winter without electricity was less about comfort and more about enduring. There was no escaping the cold entirely, there was only adaptation. Through a combination of fire, layered clothing, tight living spaces, and age-old customs passed down through generations, medieval peasants managed to survive what many today would consider unlivable conditions. Their lives were hard, but their resilience was carved into the very bones of the villages they called home. Food was survival. In the brutal months of winter, when the ground was frozen and the fields were barren, the difference between life and death often came down to what had been stored, preserved, and carefully rationed. For medieval peasants, eating in winter wasn't about taste or pleasure. It was about endurance. Every meal was a calculation, a delicate balance between necessity and scarcity. The winter diet was rooted in the preservation techniques practiced during the warmer months. There were no refrigerators or freezers, so peasants relied on a range of ancient methods to extend the life of their food. Salting was among the most common. Meat, especially pork, was heavily salted and packed into barrels or earthen jars. Salt drew out moisture, making it harder for bacteria to grow. Salted meat could last for months if kept dry and cool. Smoking was another method, with meats hung over a smoldering fire for days or even weeks, absorbing the smoke that helped prevent spoilage. Dried meat, though tough and chewy, could be rehydrated in soups or stews. Grains formed the foundation of the peasant diet. Barley, rye, and oats were milled into flour, stored in sacks, and used throughout the winter to bake coarse black bread. Bread was rarely soft or fresh in winter. It was dense, often stale, and sometimes even molded or infested with insects. But it was edible, and that was what mattered. Peasants made porridge from oats or barley, simple but filling meals that could be eaten hot, helping to warm the body from the inside. Sometimes bread was soaked in hot broth or ale to make it easier to chew. Vegetables that could be stored in root cellars were vital. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, onions, and leeks could last for months if kept in cool, dark conditions. These root vegetables were used in stews that simmered all day over the hearth. The stew pot was rarely empty. Instead, it was a continuous blend of whatever was available: bits of meat, bones, grains, and vegetables, topped up with water and salt. Known as perpetual stew, it could feed a family across multiple days, and its ingredients changed depending on what was left. It was one of the most efficient ways to extract nutrition from limited supplies. Fermentation also played a critical role. Cabbages were made into sauerkraut, which not only preserved them, but also added much-needed vitamin C, helping to stave off scurvy during the long months without fresh greens. Ale and weak beer, often safer to drink than water, were consumed daily. Brewing was done in the fall, with barrels stored for the cold season. Even children drank diluted beer as it was more hygienic than most water sources, which were frequently contaminated. Dairy products were scarce in winter, as animals produced less milk in the cold months. However, any surplus milk from the fall was transformed into cheese or butter. Hard cheeses, aged and salted, could last well into the winter and were a rare treat. Butter was sometimes buried in crocks to preserve it for as long as possible, though it became rancid quickly without cool storage. Eggs were rare in winter since hens laid fewer or no eggs during the cold months. When they did appear, they were considered valuable. Some peasants preserved eggs in lime water or ash to keep them edible longer, but this was not always possible for poorer families. Fruits, unless dried, were virtually non-existent. In some regions, apples and pears were stored in cool lofts, but they were prone to spoilage and pests. Dried fruits like plums, berries, or even wild crab apples could be rehydrated for cooking if they had been carefully stored. Hunger was a constant shadow. For many peasants, winter meant smaller portions and fewer meals. Some days might pass with only one substantial meal, usually a thick broth with a crust of bread. Fasting, both religiously motivated and circumstantially forced, was common. When supplies dwindled, meals became even more austere. Boiled weeds, foraged herbs, and thin gruel became the staples. In times of true scarcity, desperation led to boiling bones for flavor, chewing on old leather, or mixing bark into bread flour. Feasting, when it did happen, was tied to specific days on the religious calendar, like Christmas or the Feast of St. Stephen. These brief moments of abundance were cherished. A salted ham, a fresh-baked pie, perhaps some rare honey or preserved fruit. But they were rare interludes in an otherwise monotonous, Spartan culinary routine. Yet even in this stark, survival-driven environment, meals had meaning. They brought families together around the hearth. They were moments of warmth and human connection amid the cold and silence of winter. Children learned from their elders how to stretch ingredients, how to recognize spoilage, how to season a stew with only a pinch of herbs. The kitchen, however humble, was a place of life, resilience, and tradition. Every bite was earned. Every crumb mattered. Through generations of hardship, peasants developed a food culture not of luxury, but of deep wisdom, one that ensured survival in a world where the margin for error was razor thin. In a time when life was already defined by struggle, winter only magnified the difficulties of the medieval peasant. But no one faced these challenges alone. The key to surviving the harsh, unforgiving months was community. The bonds between neighbors, families, and fellow villagers were not just social niceties. They were the lifelines that kept people alive when resources were scarce and danger was everywhere. In small rural villages, every person had a role, and winter was the ultimate test of how well those roles were fulfilled and how deeply people relied on one another. Mutual aid wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The concept of the individual, as we understand it today, barely existed in this context. Life was collective. From the moment the snow began to fall until the thaw of spring, peasants leaned into the strength of the group. When someone's roof collapsed under the weight of snow, neighbors came with thatch, straw, and willing hands. If illness swept through a household, others brought soup, herbs, and warm water. Elderly villagers and widows who might have struggled to chop firewood or haul water were supported by younger, stronger members of the village. These weren't acts of charity. They were acts of survival. Today you helped your neighbor. Tomorrow, it might be you who needed their help. Shared work continued even when the fields lay dormant. Communal tasks, like mending fences, repairing tools, or butchering animals, were done together. In some villages, winter was a time for shared feasts, where families pooled their remaining resources to create one hearty meal, keeping morale high and bellies warm for at least one night. These gatherings reminded everyone that while the world outside was cold and bleak, human warmth still existed within their walls. Children played together in the snow and were watched collectively by adults, especially when parents were busy tending to livestock or preparing food. Storytelling, a central winter pastime, became a communal ritual. Elders passed down tales of saints, legends, warnings, and folklore. Lessons wrapped in entertainment that subtly taught children how to endure, how to stay safe, and how to find meaning even when life was hard. The church played a central role in fostering this sense of togetherness. It was often the only stone building in the village, offering a refuge from the elements. Inside its thick walls, people gathered not only for religious services, but also to warm themselves and reconnect with others. The church provided alms to the poor and distributed food or clothing when possible. Monasteries, in particular, were centers of aid during the winter months, offering shelter to travelers, food to the hungry, and medical care to the sick, using ancient herbal remedies and basic treatments. Festivals and religious holidays provided small but powerful moments of joy. The Feast of St. Nicholas, Christmas, and Epiphany were occasions where even the poorest peasant might receive a token gift, a warm meal, or a bit of extra bread. These celebrations weren't extravagant, but they broke the monotony of winter and reminded people of a deeper hope, that spring would come, that faith could sustain, and that life had more to offer than mere survival. Bartering and trade also became more important during the winter months. If one family had extra grain but no firewood, they could trade with another who had wood but was running low on food. These exchanges were facilitated by trust, honor, and a shared understanding that everyone had to make it through together. Hoarding, while it did occur, was frowned upon. A reputation for selfishness could isolate a person from the community, a dangerous position when survival depended on mutual dependence. In times of disaster, an unexpected blizzard, an outbreak of disease, or the sudden death of a family's primary breadwinner, the village stepped in. Orphans were often taken in by relatives or neighbors. A widow might be helped with daily chores by others in the village. If an animal vital for milk or plowing died, sometimes the community would contribute to help replace it. Not because they were wealthy, they weren't, but because the fabric of the community was stronger than individual hardship. Winter tested not just the body, but the spirit. Loneliness could be deadly. Depression, though not named as such, was known and feared. That's why people clung tightly to each other, told jokes, shared songs, and found small moments of laughter even amid suffering. Singing, dancing, and simple games were ways to remind everyone that life still pulsed beneath the snow. This sense of community extended to death as well. If someone passed away during winter, a frequent occurrence, neighbors dug the frozen ground for a proper burial. They gathered for mourning, offered food and prayers, and helped the bereaved continue on. The dead were remembered and honored, not forgotten. The village did not let anyone disappear into the silence of winter alone. Medieval peasants didn't just survive the cold, they endured it together. Their resilience was born not merely from personal strength, but from the invisible web of care, obligation, and shared humanity that held them together through the darkest season of the year. When survival meant sharing what little you had, community became the most powerful form of wealth. As winter settled in and days grew shorter, darkness became one of the most pervasive and inescapable features of medieval life. With no electricity, no street lamps, and no artificial clocks to guide their routines, medieval peasants lived according to the natural rhythms of sunlight and shadow. During the winter months, this meant navigating a world where darkness could last up to 16 hours a day. Surviving these long nights was not just about staying physically safe, it was about preserving mental clarity, emotional strength, and spiritual hope in a time when light itself felt like a fleeting luxury. The setting sun marked an unspoken curfew. Once darkness fell, most outdoor activity ceased. Roads and paths became treacherous, not only because of snow and ice, but because of the deep blackness that blanketed the world. Even on moonlit nights, visibility was limited. People feared not just natural dangers, like wild animals or sudden falls, but also the supernatural. Tales of ghosts, witches, and restless spirits were deeply ingrained in the medieval imagination. Night was the domain of the unknown, and for many, it was safer to stay indoors and close to the hearth. Inside the home, light came from fire and flame. The central hearth, which had already played a vital role in heating and cooking, also served as the main source of illumination. The flickering glow of the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls and offered enough light to carry out simple evening tasks. In wealthier households, or on special occasions, candles made from tallow, rendered animal fat, or beeswax might be used. But for most peasants, these were precious and rationed. A single candle could be a luxury item, used sparingly and with great care. Often, peasants would craft rushlights, simple torches made from dried reeds or rushes soaked in animal fat. These gave off minimal light and burned quickly, but they were easy to make and served in a pinch. Because light was so limited, daily routines shifted dramatically. People rose at dawn and worked until dusk. In winter, this meant shorter working days and longer nights. The extended hours of darkness became a time of forced stillness and introspection. Yet peasants found ways to use this time meaningfully. Many spent their evenings repairing clothing, sharpening tools, or spinning wool by firelight. Women wove, mended, and stitched, while men carved wood or fashioned simple implements. Children listened and learned, helping with small tasks and absorbing knowledge passed down through stories and oral traditions. Storytelling was one of the most vital ways to pass time and preserve culture during these dark months. With no books and few literate people, oral tradition was everything. Elders recounted tales of saints, local legends, family histories, and fables that carried moral lessons. These stories didn't just entertain, they educated and united. They reinforced values, warned of danger, and offered comfort. The rhythm of a familiar tale, the warmth of the fire, and the closeness of family gave a sense of continuity in a season that could feel endless and isolating. The long nights also became a time for religious reflection. Christianity deeply influenced every aspect of medieval life, and winter was seen as both a test and a spiritual opportunity. Prayer was more frequent in the evenings, often led by the head of the household. Families would recite the Lord's Prayer, sing hymns, or read aloud from religious texts, if they were fortunate enough to own them. Saints' days, Advent, and Christmas brought moments of light, both literal and symbolic, into the winter darkness. Churches sometimes hosted candlelit services, offering both spiritual and physical warmth to villagers. Sleep patterns were different from modern expectations. Without artificial light to extend the day, many peasants followed what historians call segmented sleep. They would go to bed shortly after nightfall, sleep for several hours, wake in the middle of the night for a short period, and then go back to sleep until dawn. During that wakeful interval, often an hour or two, they might pray, talk quietly, tend to the fire, check on animals, or even engage in intimacy. This biphasic sleep was a natural adaptation to the long, cold nights and was so common that it was considered normal. In wealthier communities or monasteries, some innovations helped push back the darkness. Oil lamps and beeswax candles were used more liberally. Windows were sometimes fitted with thin, translucent horn or mica to allow in moonlight without letting in cold air. But for the majority of peasants, such luxuries were out of reach. They relied on their own ingenuity and each other. The darkness of winter was also symbolic. It mirrored the internal struggles people faced during the season: loneliness, fear, grief, hunger, and doubt. But this darkness also provided space for introspection. In a world without distractions, silence was profound. People spent more time with their thoughts, more time in prayer, more time contemplating life and death, heaven and earth. The night became a spiritual experience, an arena in which inner strength was forged. Ultimately, medieval peasants survived the long nights not just through practical means, but through culture, community, and faith. The darkness was deep, but it was never absolute. The fire always burned, stories were always told, prayers were always whispered, and morning, though distant, always came. Light, even in the smallest flame, was enough to hold back the night.